Imagine for a moment that you are one of the 24 most hated beings on the planet. The year is 1945. The war you helped to unleash has just ended. The cities in which you once paraded as a conqueror now lie turned into mountains of rubble. The names you pronounce from the podiums are being erased from the books. And you, who believed yourself invincible, who signed orders with the exact same coldness with which one signs a business letter, who watched from luxurious offices while the world burned, now find yourself locked in a cell measuring 2 meters by 3, with a light bulb turned on 24 hours a day, with a guard who watches your every single movement through a glass peephole. You wear no belt, you wear no shoelaces. Every night, when you try to sleep, the guard opens the peephole to make sure you are still alive. What do you think in that moment? What do you say to the psychologist who arrives every morning with his notebook and his impossible questions? What do you write to your family in the letters that will be read and censored before reaching their hands? How do you justify before a tribunal of the entire world what you did, what you ordered, what you permitted? This is the history of the Nuremberg trial, told from the inside, not from the tables of the Allied prosecutors, not from the archives of Washington or London, but from the cells of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, from the benches where the architects of the Third Reich sat, from the mouths of the very Germans who lived, defended, resisted, and in some cases collapsed under the weight of what they had done. Before you settle in, take a moment to give this video a good like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to us from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world, because this history is not just about the past. It is about what occurs when absolute power faces, for the first time in the history of humanity, an absolute rendering of accounts. It is about what happens in the mind of an individual when suddenly he can no longer hide behind orders, behind the regime, behind the flag. It is about the moment when a belief system carefully constructed over decades crumbles in front of the black and white images of what that system produced. And it is about something that is very rarely told, the perspective of the Germans who were there, those who sat on that bench, those who defended them, those who testified, those who observed from the stands of the tribunal how not only a few individuals were judged, but an entire nation, an entire idea, an entire epoch. Are you ready to enter? Nuremberg, November 20th, 1945. The wind dragged dust and ash over a city that no longer existed as such. Of the 260,000 people who inhabited Nuremberg before the war, fewer than 100,000 remained there, mostly surviving in basements, in partially habitable ruins, in the remains of what was once one of the most beautiful and symbolic cities of Germany. The Allied bombings, especially the devastating attack of January 2nd, 1945, had reduced 90% of the historic centre to rubble. The cathedral was destroyed. The imperial castle, which Adolf Hitler used as a stage for his medieval fantasies of power, was an empty shell. The streets were for 12 years brown uniforms and red flags, with the swastika paraded, were full of silence, of dust, and of a smell that survivors described as the mixture between burnt stone and something they preferred not to name. And nevertheless, in the midst of that desolation, a building remained standing, imposing, functional, almost intact by the luck of the Allied bombs that fell around it, but respected it almost as if they knew it would be necessary. The Palace of Justice of Nuremberg, constructed at the end of the 19th century, with its pink sandstone walls and its high windows, its endless corridors, and its courtroom number 600. There, that 20th of November, something the world had never seen would begin, the first international criminal tribunal in history. But before entering that room, before following the trail of the 24 accused, who that day would occupy the dock, we need to ask ourselves a question that is rarely formulated. Why Nuremberg? The official answer, the one we learn in textbooks, says that Nuremberg was chosen because the Palace of Justice was intact, and had sufficient space, including an annex prison that could house the accused. That is true. But there is another reason, a symbolic reason that the very organisers of the trial openly acknowledged. Nuremberg was the symbolic heart of Nazism. It was the city where the National Socialist Party held its annual congresses, those monumental scenographies of power that Leni Riefenstahl immortalised in her propaganda films. It was the city that gave its name to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, those provisions that deprived German Jewish citizens of their citizenship, that classified them as beings of an inferior category, that laid the legal foundations of the Holocaust. Judging Nazism in Nuremberg was, in a certain sense, judging it in its own temple. It was a deliberate choice, loaded with historical meaning. The accused themselves understood it this way. When the former Minister of Foreign Affairs Joachim von Ribbentrop learned that the trial would be held in Nuremberg, he remained silent for several seconds. Then he said, almost to himself, with a voice that the interpreter could barely catch, "Nuremberg. Of course, Nuremberg," as if the choice of the location were in itself a condemnation before the process even began. To understand what happened in that room, to understand the German voices that filled those months of the process with arguments, excuses, confessions, and denials, we need to know the protagonists, and it must be done in a way that history books rarely offer us, not as symbols of evil, not as caricatures of wickedness, but as complex, contradictory human beings, sometimes terrifying and sometimes pathetically small, who sat in those wooden chairs and had to answer for what they had done. The process began with a scene that none of those present would ever forget. It was 10 in the morning on the 20th of November, 1945, when the American military guards opened the side door of courtroom 600 and the parade began to enter. One by one, the 24 accused occupied their places on the two benches situated to the right of the tribunal's platform. The photographers fired their cameras with frenzy. Journalists from all over the world, more than 250 accredited, tried to capture in their notepads the expression on each face. The first to enter was Hermann Göring, and his entrance was, like almost everything related to Göring, a perfectly calculated theatrical act. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was, at that time, 52 years old. He had been the second most powerful man of the Third Reich, founder of the Gestapo, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, designated by Hitler as his official successor. During the years of Nazi splendor, he had led a life of almost medieval excesses on his Marienhalle estate, north of Berlin, surrounded by artworks stolen from museums across Europe, by uniforms designed by himself encrusted with jewels, by lions that walked through his gardens as if they were domestic dogs. He was known for his megalomania, for his insatiable appetite, for his capacity for cruelty and for charm in equal measure. The same collaborators who feared him ended up falling under the spell of his overwhelming personality. But the Göring who entered courtroom 600 on the 20th of November, 1945, was not that individual. He was another. During the months leading up to the trial, something extraordinary had occurred. Göring, who at the moment of his capture weighed 120 kilos and depended on a severe addiction to the codeine he consumed in the form of pills, had been subjected to a detoxification process. The prison doctor, Colonel Burton Andrus, supervised the gradual withdrawal of the drug. Göring lost more than 40 kilos, and with the weight, he seemed to recover something that addiction and years of absolute power had dulled, his intellectual sharpness. The Göring who entered that room that day wore a grey suit that hung off him, as if borrowed from someone bulkier. But his gaze was that of someone who had decided exactly how he was going to play that game. Around his neck he wore no sign of his former hierarchy. The buttons were cut off his uniform when he was captured, as a symbol of degradation. But his posture, the way he sat, the way he crossed his arms and observed the room, transmitted something that profoundly discomforted the prosecutors: confidence. Next to him sat Rudolf Hess, The former deputy of the Führer was now a skeletal figure, with sunken eyes and a gaze that alternated between total absence and flashes of disturbing lucidity. Hess had flown to Scotland in May 1941 on an unauthorized peace mission that Hitler never completely understood, and had spent the following 4 years as a prisoner of the British. When he arrived in Nuremberg, he claimed to remember nothing. His benchmates, who knew him well, suspected the amnesia was faked. The psychologists could not reach an agreement, and Hess, sitting on that bench with his empty or perhaps calculated gaze, did not help to clarify the mystery. Was Hess mentally ill? Was he a brilliant simulator? Was he both things? The answer to that question remained a subject of debate for decades, and in the first days of the trial, it generated one of the most dramatic moments that no one could have anticipated. But we will speak of that in due time, because the story of Rudolf Hess in Courtroom 600 is one of the strangest and most impactful of the entire process. Behind Goering and Hess was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. If Goering radiated a calculated confidence, Ribbentrop radiated exactly the opposite. His contemporaries described him as an individual who, in the days of glory, seemed sure of himself, but who in defeat crumbled with a rapidity that was almost painful to observe. The diplomat who had negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, who had presented the ultimatums of war with the coldness of one delivering an invoice, now sat on the bench with drooping shoulders and an expression of genuine perplexity, as if he could not quite comprehend what he was doing there. One of the tribunal's secretaries, Traudl Junge, who had also worked as Hitler's personal secretary in his final months, described Ribbentrop's appearance in those first days of the trial years later with a devastating phrase. It looked as if someone had removed his spine along with his uniform. Next, Wilhelm Keitel, the former chief of the German High Command, the individual who signed the most criminal orders of the regime with his mother-of-pearl handled pen, sitting with military rigidity even though he no longer wore a uniform. Keitel was one of those individuals who generated a peculiar mixture of contempt and pity. Contempt, because he never opposed anything, because he signed everything put in front of him, because his military career was basically the story of an absolutely docile subordinate before his superior, and pity because it was evident, even in his posture, that Keitel knew it, that somewhere inside that upright body with military automatism lived a being who perfectly understood what he had done and could find no way to justify it. Next to him, Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologue of the party, the individual who wrote The Myth of the 20th Century, that work of racial pseudo-philosophy that very few read completely, but that many cited as the intellectual foundation of Nazism. Rosenberg was a walking paradox. Considered the philosopher of the movement, his own party comrades treated him with condescension, and Hitler himself never took him entirely seriously despite using him. On the bench, Rosenberg seemed even more out of place than the rest, like a university professor who has mistakenly arrived at the wrong classroom. Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of occupied Poland, the individual under whose administration the Polish territory became the stage for some of the most systematic crimes of the war. Frank was one of the few accused who, even before the trial began, had manifested something approximating repentance. He had experienced during his captivity what he himself described as a religious conversion, and he arrived at the bench with a Bible that the Catholic prison chaplain had provided him. Whether that conversion was genuine or strategic, whether it was a real transformation of the soul or the last resort of a desperate individual, is a question that the process itself did not completely answer. Wilhelm Frick, the former Minister of the Interior, legal architect of the legislative apparatus of Nazism, Julius Streicher, the publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, whose pages exhibited caricatures of Jews designed to provoke the most visceral hatred. Streicher was the accused who most discomforted even his benchmates, not because he was the most guilty in terms of state decisions, but because his anti-Semitism was so raw, so primitive, so devoid of any intellectual varnish, that his presence on the same bench as former ministers and generals produced a sensation of strangeness in all present. including the accused themselves. Walter Funk, the former Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, who among other things administered the deposits of gold obtained from the victims of the Holocaust. Hjalmar Schacht, the financial genius, who built the economy of German rearmament, but who later came into conflict with the regime. Karl Dönitz, the admiral who commanded the submarine war, and who during the final days of the Reich was designated Hitler's successor as head of state. Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the navy. Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Hitler Youth. Fritz Sauckel, the man responsible for the forced labour that turned millions of Europeans into slaves for German industry. Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations of the Armed Forces High Command, who planned military campaigns with impeccable technical precision, without asking too many questions about what occurred in the territories their armies occupied. Franz von Papen, the old guard politician who contributed decisively to bringing Hitler to power, believing he could control him, and then spent the following years being controlled by him. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands. Albert Speer, the architect of Hitler's monumental dreams, the Minister of Armaments, who kept the war machinery functioning until the last moment, the accused who would choose the most intelligent strategy of all, presenting himself as someone who did not know what was happening. Konstantin von Neurath, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs prior to Ribbentrop. Hans Fritzsche, the head of the radio division of the Ministry of Propaganda. And Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, tried in absentia because his whereabouts were unknown. Decades later, it would be established that he had died in May 1945, attempting to escape from Berlin. These were the 24 accused. These were the faces that the world would see for almost a year, on the covers of newspapers, in cinematic newsreels, in radio transmissions that reached millions of homes across the entire planet. But there is something that history books rarely tell us. Before the trial began, before that first morning of the 20th of November, there were weeks, during which those individuals lived in the cells of the Palace of Justice of Nuremberg, in a state of absolute uncertainty. And in those weeks, something occurred that would be fundamental to understanding everything that would come next. They arrived at the fourth floor of the north wing of the prison in September and October 1945. The cells measured approximately 4 meters by 3. Each had a bed, a chair, a small table, and a toilet. The windows were covered with an iron grille and, in some cases, with wooden planks that blocked natural light. The light bulb remained on 24 hours a day. Colonel Burton Andrus, the prison director, was an impeccably styled individual, with his white helmet and his white gloves, who treated his prisoners with a mixture of professional efficiency and barely disguised contempt. The rules were clear and absolute. No belts or shoelaces were allowed. Eating utensils were made of plastic. Access to any object that could serve for suicide was prohibited. The prisoners would be judged for their crimes. They would not escape that destiny by their own hand. The reason for those precautions was not solely security, it was symbolic. The Allies had learned the lesson of the final days of the Reich. Heinrich Himmler had swallowed a cyanide capsule when he was captured. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda had poisoned their 6 children and then committed suicide. Hermann Göring himself carried a cyanide capsule, hidden for months in the Mondorf-les-Bains prisoner camp in Luxembourg, before being transferred to Nuremberg. It could not happen again. These individuals had to be judged. And yet, despite all precautions, despite constant surveillance, despite the daily cell inspections, Göring would achieve the unthinkable. But that would happen at the end of the story, on the night of October 15th, 1946, and to get there we need to travel the entire path. The psychologist assigned to the prisoners was Captain Gustav Mark Gilbert, a 33-year-old psychologist born in New York to Austrian Jewish parents who spoke fluent German. Gilbert had unique and extraordinary access to the accused. He could speak with them in their cells, observe them in the tribunal, administer psychological tests. His book, published in 1947 under the title Nuremberg Diary, is one of the most extraordinary documents that exists about the process, because it records the daily conversations, the spontaneous reflections, the moments of weakness and arrogance of the accused in the intimate environment of their cells. Gilbert understood from the first day that his work was not merely academic, it was also strategic. Knowing how these individuals thought could help the prosecutors anticipate their defensive strategies. And what he discovered in those initial conversations was revealing. He found Göring, in those first days, literally reorganizing his thoughts. Göring was aware that the trial was going to be long and complicated, and he was studying the charges with the concentration of a lawyer preparing his defense. He told Gilbert in one of his first conversations, "I don't know exactly what can be said in a tribunal with these characteristics, but what I do know is that I am not going to act as if I were guilty of something of which I do not feel guilty." It was a declaration that perfectly anticipated the strategy Göring would follow throughout the whole process. He found Hess in a state he described as dissociated from reality. Hess claimed to not remember his former colleagues, not recognize documents he himself had signed, not have any memory of events in which he had participated. But when Gilbert spoke to him of topics that clearly impassioned Hess, about astrology or about conspiracy theories, the shine in his eyes was unmistakable. Something was working inside there. He found Ribbentrop collapsed, literally incapable of articulating a coherent defense. Ribbentrop repeated to him time and time again that he did not understand why he was there, that he had only followed the Führer's instructions, that he was a diplomat, not a criminal. Gilbert noted in his diary, "The difference between Ribbentrop and Göring is the difference between an individual who has nothing and one who has everything prepared. Ribbentrop comes to the trial empty-handed." He found Frank in a state of intense religious agitation. Frank showed him the rosary that Father Sixtus O'Connor, the Catholic prison chaplain, had provided him. He spoke of his conversion with an intensity that Gilbert described as disturbing in its sincerity. Frank openly admitted his guilt. He told him, "I know what happened in Poland under my government. I cannot escape that. The only thing I can do is face it." He found Streicher unsettling. Streicher in his cell was no different from the Streicher who had incited hatred from the pages of his newspaper for 12 years. His conversations with Gilbert were full of anti-Semitic theories that he formulated with the same conviction as if he were in his editorial office. He did not seem to understand that those ideas were precisely the reason he was there. Gilbert administered the Rorschach test to all the accused, those cards with symmetrical ink blots used to explore personality. Streicher's results were among the most disturbing of the group. The history of the Rorschach tests of the Nuremberg defendants is fascinating in itself, and has been the subject of analysis for decades. In 1976, psychologist Molly Harrower published a study in which she compared the test results of the accused with those of a group of Protestant pastors. The objective was to challenge the idea that war criminals were psychologically distinct from the rest of humanity. Her conclusions were uncomfortable. She found no statistically significant differences between the two groups, which meant that the evil of the Third Reich did not require a special psychology. It required a system, an ideology, a structure of obedience. The conclusion was more disturbing than any diagnosis of psychopathy. These individuals were not monsters in clinical terms. They were, in many senses, normal people who had done extraordinarily terrible things. But let us return to those weeks prior to the trial, because there is a moment that cannot be overlooked. The moment when the accused received the charges. On October 19th, 1945, 1 month before the start of the process, the accused was summoned to receive the copy of the indictment. It was more than 200 pages. The document listed 4 counts. The first, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. The second, planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression. The third, war crimes. The fourth, crimes against humanity. This last charge was the newest, the boldest, the one representing the greatest legal novelty of the process. For the first time in history, An international tribunal judged individuals not only for what they had done to enemy combatants, but for what they had done to civilians, including citizens of their own country. The reaction of the accused upon receiving that document varied greatly. Goering took it, weighed it in his hand as if evaluating its price, and said, "We will have plenty of material to work with." It was the reaction of someone who saw in the trial an opportunity, not just a threat. Ribbentrop held it for several minutes without opening it, with an expression that his defense lawyer, Martin Horn, later described as that of someone receiving news of a death they already expected but hoped never to receive. Frank opened it immediately and began to read. When he reached the paragraphs about Poland, he lowered the document and stared at the wall for several minutes. The guard on duty noted in his daily report that Frank had cried. Keitel, according to Captain Gilbert, read the charges in a military fashion, without getting altered, and then asked for pen and paper to start taking notes. It was his way of maintaining control, turning horror into a technical problem that could be tackled with order and methodology. Speer immediately asked to meet with his defense lawyer, Hans Flaxner. It was the reaction of someone who already had his strategy clear and wanted to start building it. And then there was Hess, who, when he received the indictment, looked at it for a moment, left it on the table in his cell, and said to the guard supervising him, "I remember nothing of all this." 3 words that would be Rudolf Hess's mantra throughout the entire process. The selection of the defense attorneys was in itself a complicated process. The accused had the right to choose their own defender, and most chose German lawyers, with experience in criminal law. But there was a problem. Many German lawyers, especially the most reputable, did not want to defend the accused at Nuremberg, not necessarily for ethical reasons, although those existed, but out of fear of social stigma. In post-war Germany, defending those primarily responsible for Nazism was not a career many jurists aspired to. Those who accepted the defense did so for diverse reasons. Some genuinely believed in the principle that every accused deserves a vigorous defense, regardless of what they have done. Others were openly sympathizers of the regime who had not been detained because they were less prominent. Others saw in the trial a unique, professional opportunity, even if it was an opportunity loaded with risks. Otto Stahmer, who defended Göring, was a 66-year-old lawyer from Hamburg with experience in complex criminal cases. Göring chose him not because he knew him previously, but because his reputation suggested he was capable of constructing technically solid arguments. Göring was very clear that he did not want a lawyer who would apologize to the tribunal on his behalf. He wanted someone who could turn the trial into a platform. The relationship between Göring and Stahmer was tense from the beginning in a productive sense. Göring was much more intelligent than his own lawyer, and Stahmer knew it. In practice, Göring's defense was designed almost completely by Göring himself, with Stahmer acting more as a technical spokesman than a strategist. When Göring took the witness stand in March 1946, what the world saw was not the defense of an accused before a tribunal. It was the speech of a political leader before history. But before reaching that crucial moment, one must understand the structure of the process and why it was, from a legal point of view, something genuinely unprecedented. The International Military Tribunal was established by the London Agreement of August 8, 1945, signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Each nation appointed a main judge and an alternate judge. For the United States, former Secretary of State Francis Biddle. For the United Kingdom, Geoffrey Lawrence, who would act as president of the tribunal. For the Soviet Union, General Iona Nikitchenko. For France, Professor Henri Doniger de Vabre. The main prosecutors were also 4, 1 per nation. Justice Robert Jackson for the United States, Sir Hartley Shawcross for the United Kingdom, Roman Rudenko for the Soviet Union, and François de Menton for France. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics and also help the participation of the video. Alright. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. The presence of the Soviet Union in the tribunal as an accusing power generated from the beginning and discomfort that the German defenders would exploit throughout the entire process. The USSR was one of the nations judging the accused for crimes against peace, but it was also the country that had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, that secret pact that divided Poland and the Baltic states between Germany and the Soviet Union. The German defense lawyers knew it, and several of them would attempt to use it. The Soviet Union was also the country that had committed the Katyn massacre, the murder of more than 20,000 Polish officers in the forests of Katyn, Kalinin, and Kharkiv in 1940. The Soviet prosecutors, with an audacity that left Western prosecutors speechless, included Katyn in the charges against the Germans, attributing the massacre to the SS. The Germans had discovered it in 1943 when their troops found the mass graves during the occupation. The Poles in exile had spent months trying to get their allies to investigate the true attribution of the crime. The Nuremberg tribunal, in a decision that history would judge very negatively, simply omitted the Katyn massacre in its final verdict. It attributed responsibility neither to the Germans nor to the Soviets. The silence was a political decision, and everyone in the room knew it. The truth about Katyn was not officially recognized by the Soviet Union until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev admitted that the Soviet NKVD was responsible. By 1945, it was a secret that the Soviet power could not afford to let come to light in courtroom 600 of Nuremberg. This is one of the first great tensions that defined the process from its inception. It was a tribunal of victors judging the vanquished, and that fundamental asymmetry never completely disappeared. The German defenders pointed it out repeatedly, and although their arguments did not change the outcome of the process, they left a mark on the history of international law that still generates debate today. Justice Jackson himself, the most brilliant of the Allied prosecutors, recognized in a private letter to President Truman, written in June 1945, that the challenge of the process was to construct something just in conditions that were not entirely just. He wrote, "Let us be honest. The crimes we are prosecuting are crimes in which we ourselves have participated or might have participated." It was an extraordinary admission of honesty, and also a sign of how aware Jackson was of the fragilities of the process he was constructing. On November 20th, at 10 in the morning, Jeffrey Lawrence opened the session with these words. In English, the International Military Tribunal constituted under the London Agreement of the 8th of August, 1945, is now in session. And with those words, something that had never existed began to function. Before the charges were read, there was a process that proved extraordinary in its implications, the reading of the indictment. It lasted 2 full days, 2 days during which the accused, seated on their benches, with headphones through which the simultaneous translation arrived, listened systematically to the enumeration of the crimes attributed to them, the wars of aggression, the deportations, the concentration camps, the mass executions, the medical experiments on human beings, the slave labour, the systematic extermination of entire peoples. How does one listen to something like that when you are the accused? The answer, which Gilbert documented with extraordinary precision, was completely different for each one. Goering listened with absolute concentration, taking notes at times, with the demeanour of a lawyer studying the opponent's arguments. Ribbentrop had his headphones on, but his gaze was lost on a fixed point in front of him, as if his mind were in another place. Hess was reading a book. Literally, Hess had a book on his lap and read it during the reading of the charges. The book, which Gilbert could see from his position, was a historical novel. Frank listened with his eyes closed. Keitel listened with the rigidity of someone receiving a disagreeable order and can do nothing to avoid it. Stryker listened nodding slightly, as if agreeing with what was being said. which generated massive confusion among the observers until Gilbert understood that Streicher was not nodding at the crimes, but at his own conviction that everything he had done was justified. Speer listened with an expression that Gilbert described as the most skillfully calculated on the bench, neither defensive nor indifferent, but of apparent concern that could be interpreted as moral conscience. It was, according to Gilbert, the face that an intelligent individual chooses when he knows the world is watching him. The first formal charge was read on December 1st, 1945. The accused, one by one, had to stand up and declare whether they recognised themselves as guilty or not guilty. This is another of the scenes of the process that is rarely remembered, but which was extraordinarily significant. Goering was the first. He stood up, took the microphone and said, "I declare myself not guilty in the sense of the charges presented." He immediately added an additional phrase that President Lawrence had to interrupt because the procedure did not allow additional statements at that moment. "I reserve the right to make a more extensive statement later on." Lawrence asked him to limit himself to declaring guilty or not guilty. Goering, unbothered, said simply, "Not guilty." And he sat down with the discreet satisfaction of someone who has just done exactly what he planned. Hess stood up and said in German, 9. No, that was all. 9. The room took a moment to process that this was his declaration of innocence. Ribbentrop said, with a barely audible voice, "Not guilty," and sat back down looking at the floor. Keitel said, with his precise military diction, "I declare myself not guilty before God and before the tribunal." Lawrence asked him equally to stick to the formula. Keitel said, "Not guilty." Frank was the only one of the 24 who uttered something nobody expected. Instead of simply saying "not guilty," he said it in German. "I declare myself guilty in the sense that I pronounce myself against the charges of accusation and the presentation made." It was a formulation so ambiguous that the tribunal had to clarify it. Was he declaring himself guilty or not guilty? Frank, after a pause, said, "Not guilty." But everyone in the room knew that what Frank had meant to say was something more complex, something he would develop over the following months. Schacht was one of the most direct. "Completely not guilty." Speer said calmly, "Not guilty." Von Neurath said, "Not guilty." Fritzsche said, "In the name of God, not guilty." The formal process had begun, and with it began something that its organisers had not completely anticipated, the battle for control of the narrative. Because there is something that textbooks usually omit about the Nuremberg trial. The accused were not passive. They were not simply objects of the process. They were active subjects, attempting with the resources they had left to influence how what was happening in that room would be remembered. And the most skilled of them all in that strategy was, indisputably, Hermann Göring. To understand what Göring was doing in Nuremberg, we need to understand who Hermann Göring was before becoming the number 2 of the Third Reich. He was born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, the son of Heinrich Ernst Göring, a colonial official and diplomat, and Franziska Tiefenbrunn. His childhood was marked by a peculiar absence. His father was appointed consul general in Haiti when Hermann was a baby, and he spent the first 2 years of his life in Fürth, Bavaria, in the home of a family friend, Ritter Hermann von Eppenstein, a doctor of Jewish origin who would become Hermann's godfather and his mother's lover. This complicated relationship, which Göring's biographers have analysed extensively, would mark his childhood in ways he himself never quite wanted to acknowledge. He lived for several years in Eppenstein's castle in Mautendorf, enjoying a life of privilege that was not his but borrowed, dependent on the generosity of an individual whom the Nazism he himself would embrace years later would have considered his racial enemy. Göring was aware of this contradiction when an Allied journalist asked him during the Nuremberg process what would have happened to Eppenstein if he had lived until the 30s. Göring responded unfazed, "I would have protected him, just as I also protected others who were worth it." It was a response that revealed a lot. For Göring, The regime's anti-Semitism was an instrument of power, not a profound personal belief. He could apply it when it suited him and suspend it when it did not. He was, in this, as in so many other things, pragmatic to the point of cynicism. During the First World War, Göring was an exceptional combat pilot. He achieved 22 confirmed aerial victories and received the highest German military decoration, the Pour le Mérite. He was the last commander of the famous Jagdgeschwader Richthofen, the squadron previously led by the Red Baron. At the end of the war, when Germany capitulated, Göring refused to surrender his plane to the French, as the armistice conditions demanded. He destroyed it himself. It was a gesture of pride that perfectly prefigured his character. The years of the Weimar Republic were difficult years for Göring. Without a war to wage, without a hierarchy to give him structure, he attempted various lives. He worked for a Swedish airplane company. He married the Swedish Baroness Karin von Kanzau, with whom he fell deeply in love. It was his wife Karin who introduced him to the Munich Circle, where he met Adolf Hitler in November 1922. Göring was fascinated, not by the ideology, although he adopted it with conviction, but by the phenomenon. Hitler was, for Göring, the type of magnetic leader he himself aspired to be without possessing the necessary oratorical skill. In the beer hall putsch of November 1923, Göring was severely wounded in the thigh. He fled to Austria and then to Sweden, where the morphine administered to treat the pain of the wound developed in him the addiction that would accompany him the rest of his life. During his confinement in a Swedish psychiatric hospital, where he was interned for a violent episode related to the addiction, Göring received electroconvulsive therapy. It was 1925. Karin died in 1931, when Nazism was beginning to rise. When Göring arrived at the Nuremberg bench in 1945, he carried with him all that weight: the war victories, the lost love, the years of excess, the fall. And he had decided that in Nuremberg he was going to deliver one last great performance, not to save his life, because intellectually he had already reached the conclusion that there would be no possible salvation, but to control how he would be remembered, to write to some extent the final chapter of his own story. This motivation, that of controlling the historical narrative, is fundamental to understanding what occurred in the tribunal when Göring took the witness stand on March 13th, 1946. The prosecutor for the direct interrogation of Göring was Colonel Telford Taylor, a brilliant American lawyer who at 37 years old directed the war crimes section of the American prosecution. But before Taylor, it was Jackson himself who decided to conduct the cross-examination of Göring, a decision that would become one of the most recognized errors of his career. Jackson had all the material in the world: documents, signed orders, recordings, testimonies. The evidence against Göring was overwhelming, but Jackson made the mistake of trying to challenge Göring on the terrain where Göring was strongest: argumentation. Instead of limiting himself to presenting incriminating documents and asking for confirmations or denials, Jackson entered into an ideological debate with Göring, and Göring was, of the two, the better debater. Not because Göring was right, not because his arguments were legally valid, but because Göring was faster, more agile, more willing for direct confrontation. While Jackson searched through his papers, Göring answered. While Jackson tried to formulate questions that gave Göring no room to expand, Göring found exactly the space and occupied it. One of the most tense moments was when Jackson attempted to establish that Göring knew, from the beginning, that the invasion of Poland in September 1939 was a war of aggression. Jackson asked if Göring had supported the decision to invade Poland. Göring replied, "It is not a question of whether I supported the decision or not. It is a question of Germany having legitimate reasons to act as it did, and those reasons include the treatment of the German minority in Poland and the systematic denial of the rights that the Treaty of Versailles had promised." Jackson insisted, "Did you know that invading Poland would mean a war with Great Britain and France?" Göring, I considered it possible. I did not consider it certain. Jackson: But you considered it possible. And even so, did you support the invasion? Göring: Mr. Prosecutor, if every head of state who makes military decisions knowing there is a possibility the war might expand were considered a war criminal, there would be few statesmen in history who would not be guilty of the exact same charges imputed to me. It was a legally weak but politically powerful argument, and it produced exactly the effect Göring sought, a murmur in the room and an expression of irritation on Jackson's face that was captured by all the cameras. President Lawrence had to intervene several times to ask Göring to answer the questions with yes or no. Instead of making statements, Göring protested. I cannot answer questions that require an explanation with yes or no. That would be distorting the truth. Lawrence, with the visible patience of someone trying to maintain order without appearing biased, insisted that the procedure required concise answers. Göring tilted his head slightly, as if agreeing, and then gave his next answer with 3 paragraphs of elaboration. It was a fascinating and uncomfortable spectacle for the audience in the room, the most powerful prosecutor in the world, trying to control a prisoner who refused to behave as one. But the moment of greatest tension, the moment that remained engraved in the memory of everyone present, came when Jackson presented a recording. It was a recording of a meeting on October 14th, 1938, in which Göring presided over a conference on the solution to the Jewish question following the pogroms of the Knights of Broken Glass. In that meeting, Göring's voice said, with total clarity, that Jews must be excluded from the German economy and that any property damage during the pogroms should be compensated by the Jewish community, not by the perpetrators. When the recording finished, Jackson asked, "Do you recognize that voice?" Göring answered without hesitation, "Yes, that is my voice. And the words you just heard, they are my words. And the policies it describes, they were the policies of the German government." The coldness with which Göring confirmed all that, without apology, without nuance, with the same calm with which he might confirm being the author of a business letter, was almost more disturbing than any denial. He felt no guilt, or if he felt it, he did not show it, and not showing it was his ultimate form of power. But let us leave Göring on that stand for a moment, because there is another story that occurred in parallel during those first months of the process, a story involving the prison chaplains that reveals something profound about what the accused really thought when the cameras were not focusing on them. Reverend Henry Gericke was a Lutheran chaplain from Missouri, who spoke German and was assigned to the Protestant prisoners at Nuremberg. He worked with Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Dönitz, Raeder, Funk, von Schirach, Sauckel, Speer, Fritzsche, Streicher, Rosenberg, Jodl, and von Papen. Father Sixtus O'Connor, a Franciscan priest from New York, attended to the Catholics, Frank, Seyss-Inquart, Kaltenbrunner, and von Neurath. Gericke arrived in Nuremberg without any enthusiasm for the mission. He was a 60-year-old military chaplain who had seen the liberated concentration camps and who had no personal sympathy for the individuals he was to minister to spiritually. But his religious training and his sense of duty prevented him from rejecting the assignment. In his memoirs, published years after his death, he wrote, "It was not my patients who mattered to me at first. It was the question, could the gospel reach even someone like Göring?" The answer Gericke found was complicated. Göring rejected any serious religious conversation from the start. He was, according to Gericke, completely skeptical in matters of faith. He told the chaplain in their first conversation, "I have no problem with you visiting me, Reverend, but do not expect to convince me that there is a God who had anything to do with what happened in Germany during the last 12 years. It was a declaration that Gericke found more honest than disturbing. Ribbentrop, on the contrary, found in Gericke a sympathetic ear for his anxieties. Ribbentrop was profoundly superstitious and lived in a state of permanent moral confusion. His conversations with the chaplain, according to the records Gericke published, were long and chaotic. He jumped from politics to religion, from the defense of his own actions to the admission that something had gone terribly wrong, without being able to specify what or when. Guernica described him as the most disoriented soul I encountered in those months. Keitel, instead, developed a relationship of profound seriousness with the chaplain. Keitel was a practicing Lutheran, and the conversations with Guernica gave spiritual structure to his days. According to Guernica, Keitel spoke extensively of his internal conflict. He knew he had signed criminal orders. He knew he had no sufficient excuse. But he also knew he was a soldier who had done what soldiers do: obey. Where did duty end and crime begin? That question, which is also the question the Nuremberg trial tried to answer, tormented Keitel throughout the whole process. In one of his conversations with Guernica, Keitel said something the chaplain considered so significant that he noted it verbatim in his diary. "If I had had the courage to disobey even once, I would have had the courage to disobey other times. But I never found that moment, and now I pay the price of that failure. It was not an exculpation, it was an autopsy of moral cowardice." Father O'Connor's history with the Catholic accused is equally revealing. Frank, as we have mentioned, was already in a process of religious transformation before the process began. His conversations with O'Connor were profound and frequent. Frank spoke to him about the months he governed Poland, about the mass executions he ordered or permitted, about the moment he saw the first reports on the deportations to the extermination camps. He told him something O'Connor would always remember. "It wasn't me who did all this. It was me who did not stop it. And that is worse, because it means I knew I could have stopped it." It was a sophisticated and morally significant distinction, not the total denial that many others practiced, but the admission that he had had the option to resist and had chosen not to resist. Kaltenbrunner was the most difficult case for O'Connor. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the chief of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, which supervised the SS, the Gestapo, and the entire extermination apparatus. He was, in the chain of command of the Holocaust, the individual most directly responsible for the implementation of the final solution after the death of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. Physically imposing, with a scar that crossed his left cheek, Kaltenbrunner systematically denied all involvement in the crimes attributed to him. His conversations with O'Connor were brief and defensive. The priest noted, "I found in him no indication that he understood the magnitude of what the institutions under his command had done. Seyss-Inquart was different. The former Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands, responsible for the deportation of more than 100,000 Dutch Jews to the extermination camps, showed before O'Connor something the priest described as an awareness of the evil done that coexisted with an inability to understand why he had done it. He was an individual who, in the words of the priest, could accurately describe the magnitude of the harm caused, but could not connect that harm with his own decisions. This dissociation between the knowledge of the crime and the perception of one's own responsibility was one of the most disturbing findings of all that Gilbert, Guernica, and O'Connor documented during those months. It wasn't just Seyss-Inquart, it was the majority, the human capacity to create mental compartments that prevent connecting the chain of causality between one's own decisions and their extreme consequences, is something that the Nuremberg trial demonstrated devastatingly clearly. But let us return to the tribunal, because there is a moment in the process that preceded all the interrogations, and which many consider the emotional turning point of the entire trial. The moment when courtroom 600 saw the future walk through the door in the form of a film. On November 29th, 1945, 9 days after the trial began, American prosecutor Thomas Dodd announced that the prosecution would present a special piece of evidence. The lights in the room were dimmed, a cinema screen was unrolled, and Nazi concentration and prison camps began to project. A 59-minute documentary compiled from footage filmed by the Allied soldiers themselves when they liberated the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen. What was seen on that screen was the most brutal evidence any words could transmit. The images of corpses piled up in Bergen-Belsen, filmed by the British soldiers who liberated the camp in April 1945. The crematorium ovens of Dachau, the survivors of Buchenwald, with their faces like parchment, their huge eyes in their skeletal faces, staring at the camera with an expression that had no name in any language. The mass graves, the piles of shoes, of glasses, of human hair, the lists of names, the numbers tattooed on arms. The lights came on 59 minutes later. Gilbert had been observing the accused with the same attention a doctor uses to observe his patients. What he saw was, as he wrote in his diary that night, the most significant thing that had happened since I arrived at this trial. Schacht turned away from the screen and looked in the opposite direction for almost the entire projection. Frank covered his eyes with his hands and wept visibly. Ribbentrop lowered his head and did not raise it until the film ended. Hess, who had read a novel during the reading of the charges, watched the screen with a disconcerting intensity, but his expression showed no recognizable emotion. Goering was the most controlled, or at least the one who best controlled the visible. He watched the screen without looking away, with an expression Gilbert described as deliberately blank. But what happened after the lights came on was more revealing than the screening itself. The accused were returned to their cells for lunch. Gilbert visited each cell throughout the midday. In Goering's cell, he found an individual who, for the first time since Gilbert had known him, seemed destabilized. Not much, but enough for it to be visible. Goering told him, "That was something well prepared. I will not say it was not moving." It was the closest admission to emotion Goering would make during the entire process. In Frank's cell, Gilbert found the former Governor-General completely shattered. Frank told him, his voice breaking, that should never exist again, never again in history. And when Gilbert asked him if that was his genuine reaction, Frank replied, "How could it not be? I was there. Not in those camps, but in that system. I cannot separate myself from that system." In Streicher's cell, the reaction was different from all the others. Streicher told Gilbert that the images were exaggerated and that Allied propaganda had amplified reality. When Gilbert pointed out that the images were direct footage from the Allied soldiers themselves, without editing or manipulation, Streicher responded, "All filming is manipulation." It was the response of someone whose worldview was so impermeable to evidence that no amount of visual proof could penetrate it. In Speer's cell, Gilbert found something that left him thinking for days. Speer told him in a low voice, I didn't know the magnitude." Gilbert noted in his diary, "Speer is the only one on that bench who seems genuinely disturbed by what he saw, but he is also the only one who clearly had access to enough information to have known if he had wanted to. The question is whether not knowing is something that deserves moral credit when not knowing is the result of not wanting to know. It was a question the Nuremberg process would not answer definitively. And it is also, in a certain way, the central moral question of the 20th century. Before continuing with the development of the trial, we need to pause on the city where all this was happening, because Nuremberg was not just the stage of the process, it was also a living city, or trying to be, a city trying to reconstruct its identity in the exact space where the history being judged had been manufactured. Of the 450 hectares of Nuremberg's historic centre, more than 90% had been destroyed. The medieval market, the church of St. Lorenz, the 14th century walls, the bridges over the Pegnitz River, all in rubble or seriously damaged. The city that in the 15th and 16th centuries was one of the most important cultural centres of the Holy Roman Empire, the city of Albrecht Dürer and Hans Sachs, the city the Nazis had chosen as the stage for their power rituals precisely because of its German historical symbolism, was now a field of ruins. Its inhabitants survived as they could. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was one of the harshest of the post-war period. Food rationing meant that the majority of Germans had no more than 1,200 calories a day. The water and heating systems did not function in most of the city. Coal was a luxury. The survivors of the bombing lived in the basements of partially destroyed buildings, in makeshift shelters, in the remains of what once were homes. And in the centre of that desolation, in the Palace of Justice, that was one of the few large buildings still functioning. The most expensive trial in history up to that moment consumed tons of paper, the energies of hundreds of lawyers, interpreters, stenographers, guards, and the logistical resources of the four victorious powers. The Germans of Nuremberg had profoundly ambivalent feelings about the trial. Some supported it with conviction. They saw in it the possibility of a necessary rendering of accounts, the first step towards a Germany that could look at its past with honesty. Others resented it as an imposition of the victors, a process designed not to do justice but to humiliate. And others, the majority perhaps, were simply too exhausted, too busy surviving, to have articulate opinions about what was happening in the Palace of Justice. The German journalist Erich Kästner, famous before the war for his children's novels like Emil and the Detectives, and who had spent the Nazi years in a kind of internal resistance publishing under a pseudonym, visited the tribunal in January 1946. He wrote in his diary, "Being here is a strange experience. I know the names of all those on that bench. I heard them deliver speeches from podiums illuminated by torches. I saw them in the newsreels in their gleaming uniforms. Now they are there, in grey or brown suits, without insignia, without medals, looking like accountants waiting for their employment file to be read. It is difficult to connect these individuals with what they did. Not impossible, difficult." It was an observation that perfectly captured the banality that Hannah Arendt would later describe in her book on the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, with the expression banality of evil, the idea that perpetrators of extraordinary crimes are not necessarily extraordinary beings. They are ordinary people who in extraordinary circumstances did things that history cannot and should not forgive. Kästner's observation also had another dimension. The difficulty of connecting the present with the past was a problem that did not only affect external observers, it affected the accused themselves. In their conversations with Gilbert, several of them described a sensation that the psychologists found both clinically interesting and morally disturbing. The sensation that the individual sitting on that bench was different from the individual who had made those decisions, not because they denied having been that person, but because the context was so radically different that the continuity of identity felt broken. Ribbentrop said it to Gilbert almost explicitly. The individual who signed that pact, the one who was in those meetings, lived in a completely different world from this one. It was not the same world. Words had different meanings. Decisions carried different weights. I try to explain that to them, but I cannot. It was not an excuse. It was a description, perhaps genuine, of the dislocation that absolute defeat produces. Even Goering, who was the most lucid and aware of them all, described something similar in a conversation with Gilbert. The Goering, who was on that bench in 1938, signing documents and presiding over conferences, lived in a reality so different from this one, that sometimes I find it difficult to remember exactly what I thought in that moment, not because I don't remember, but because the world in which I thought those things has disappeared so completely that it seems like a fiction. Gilbert noted in his diary, "This is the most dangerous thing of all, the human capacity to close mental doors between different stages of one's own life, so that the crimes of the past remain in a sealed compartment to which the present has no direct access. It is not sociopathy, it is something more common and more terrifying." Let us return now to the process, because in the early months of 1946, after the prosecution presented its case, the turn for the defences arrived. And it was at that moment when the trial turned into something different, something more complex than its organisers had foreseen. On March 20th, 1946, Hermann Göring took the witness stand. It was a moment the whole world had been waiting for. Göring was the most prominent accused, the one who best knew the regime from the inside, the one who had the most to say, and also the one who had most prepared his statement. He took the stand with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants every step to be observed. He adjusted his headphones for the simultaneous translation system. He placed his papers carefully in front of him, and he looked at the tribunal, at the prosecutors, at the room full of journalists and observers, with the expression of someone who has anticipated this moment with eagerness. His initial statement lasted 2 full days, 2 days in which Göring reconstructed the history of Germany since 1918, from the defeat in the First World War, from the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, to the rise of Nazism and the decisions that had brought him to that stand. It was a narrative that Göring controlled with mastery, choosing what to include and what to omit, constructing a vision of history that was partial, biased, and sometimes directly false, but which was presented with such confidence and such a wealth of detail that it proved difficult to challenge in real time. What Göring argued in essence was the following. Germany had been the victim of an unjust peace in 1918 that had left it without resources, without territory, without a future. Nazism had been the response of a desperate nation to that injustice. The wars Germany fought were wars of national survival, not wars of aggression. And the crimes attributed to the regime were, in many cases, crimes also committed by the Allies. It was the argument of tu quoque, the you did it too, which the German defenders would use repeatedly throughout the process. And legally the tribunal would consistently reject it. The fact that others have also committed crimes does not exonerate the accused of theirs. But politically, before public opinion, the argument resonated, and Göring knew it. When Jackson took his turn for the cross-examination, the room braced for what promised to be a clash of titans, and it was a clash. But not exactly the one Jackson had foreseen. The first day of the cross-examination was a disaster for the prosecution. Jackson arrived with carefully prepared questions, with precise documents, expecting Göring to respond defensively and that he could tighten the net. What happened was different. Göring answered Jackson's questions with lengthy historical digressions that Jackson tried to interrupt, and when Lawrence asked him to simply answer the question, Göring would say, "Yes, Mr. President," and then give a 2-sentence answer that technically complied with the format, but always included a twist that left Jackson without the point he sought. When Jackson presented documents directly implicating Göring in criminal decisions, Göring admitted them without difficulty, explained the context, and concluded that within that context, the decision was understandable or necessary. He did not deny the facts. He reframed their meaning. It was during this cross-examination that a moment occurred which became part of the trial's legend. Jackson presented a document describing a meeting on May 27, 1941, in which top Nazi officials discussed the possibility that the war against the Soviet Union would cause the death of tens of millions of Soviet civilians due to food shortages, and in which they concluded that this prospect was economically necessary and should not change the invasion plans. Jackson asked Göring if he was aware of those discussions. Göring replied, "That specific meeting I do not remember." Jackson, "But is it possible it took place?" Göring, "In the context of planning the Russian campaign, many meetings took place on many topics. I cannot confirm or deny a specific meeting I do not remember." Jackson, frustrated, changed tactics and asked, "Were you aware that the campaign in the East could produce the death of millions of civilians?" Göring, "I was aware that any war produces civilian deaths. The war that Allies waged against Germany also produced the death of millions of civilians. The difference you establish between those deaths and those you attribute to me is a difference I cannot accept." It was the boldest moment of the cross-examination. Jackson, visibly angered, said, "The difference is that those deaths were unintended consequences of military operations against military targets. What you describe is the premeditated death of civilians as the result of a deliberate policy." Göring, "Mr. Prosecutor, I invite you to discuss the bombing of Dresden with that distinction in mind. President Lawrence intervened. Mr. Göring must limit himself to answering the questions. Göring: Of course, Mr. President. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Dresden. In February 1945, Allied bombings on the historic city of Dresden had killed between 25,000 and 35,000 people, the vast majority civilians. It was an open wound in the Allied conscience, and Göring had touched it with surgical precision. Jackson did not reply to the mention of Dresden. He couldn't. The tribunal protocol did not allow him to enter that debate. He moved to another question, but the point hung floating in the room like a ghost. After that day's session, Gilbert visited Göring in his cell. He found him in a state of obvious satisfaction that he made no attempt to hide. He asked him, "How was it?" with the tone of an actor asking for the director's opinion on his performance. Gilbert replied that his behaviour had been impressive as a performance, but morally unacceptable as a response to documented crimes. Göring shrugged slightly. The world will remember that I did not break down. The world will remember that I explained things exactly as they were. That is what matters to me. And he was right about one thing. The world remembered. The transcripts of Göring's cross-examination are still studied today in law schools as an example of the difficulties of interrogating an intelligent and determined witness, not as a model of legal virtue, but as a demonstration of the limits of the adversarial process, when one of the actors has nothing to lose. But there was a moment, just one moment, when Göring's defence fractured, and it was so unexpected that none of the observers were completely prepared for it. On April 2nd, 1946, Soviet prosecutor Roman Rudenko took his turn for the cross-examination. Rudenko was different from Jackson, more direct, less prone to philosophical arguments, more focused on concrete facts, and he held in his hands a document that none of the defence lawyers had seen. It was a copy of the Wannsee Conference, held on January 20th, 1942. In that conference, convened by Reinhard Heydrich, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials discussed and coordinated the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic extermination of all Jews in occupied Europe. The conference protocol, drafted by Adolf Eichmann, was found by the Allies among captured German archives. Rudenko presented the document and asked Göring, "Were you aware of the decisions made at this conference?" Göring looked at the document. He studied it, and for the first time since taking the stand, he took several seconds to answer. Of the specific conclusions of that conference, I was not informed directly. Rudenko: But were you aware that there was a policy of extermination for European Jews? Another pause, longer than the last. I knew there was a policy of deportation. I knew camps existed where the deportees were sent. The specific conditions of those camps, the exact scale of what occurred in them, the specific orders of extermination. I cannot claim that I knew all those details. Rudenko: But did you sign the document of January 29th, 1941, which authorized Heydrich to take all necessary measures to achieve the final solution to the Jewish question in European territories under German influence? The document was exhibited. The signature was unequivocally Göring's. I signed that document. Its text refers to the final solution, but in that specific context, that expression referred to forced emigration, not to extermination. Rudenko: How can you claim that when the document bears your signature and forms part of a chain of documents that culminated in the policy of extermination? Göring: Because I drafted that document, and at the moment I drafted it, its meaning was what I just described. The room fell silent. It was the first time Göring had given an answer that sounded like a justification rather than an argument. It was the first crack in the armour, and Rudenko didn't let it pass. So you assert that when you signed that document in January 1941, there was no discussion, no plan, no consideration of a systematic extermination. At that specific moment, the internal debate was about emigration. And by January 1942, when the Wannsee Conference was held, you didn't know what had changed. By that date, the war had changed many things. Had the policy changed to extermination? I did not make the decisions about the camps. Those decisions were made by Himmler. But did you sign the initial authorization? Yes. It was the only yes without an additional comment that Göring pronounced in the entire process. Captain Gilbert visited Göring that afternoon. He found him quieter than usual. After several minutes of silence, Göring told him, "Today was not so good." It was the first and last time Göring would admit to Gilbert that the process was not completely under his control. While all this was happening in courtroom 600, in the cells on the 4th floor, another story was unfolding, parallel and in certain moments more intimate and more revealing than what happened under the tribunal spotlights. Rudolf Hess had maintained his claim of complete amnesia throughout the months preceding the trial and during the first months of the process. He did not recognize his benchmates. He did not recognize documents. He did not seem capable of participating in the preparation of his defense. His lawyer, Alfred Seidel, was desperate. But on November 24th, 1945, 4 days after the start of the trial, something extraordinary happened. The tribunal was considering whether Hess should be declared mentally unfit to stand trial and excluded from the proceedings, when Hess asked permission to make a statement. Lawrence granted him the floor, and Hess, who days before had not recognized the prosecutor who presented him with the charges nor the colleagues who had known him for years, said the following: "From the beginning of the process, I must have seemed to the witnesses and my comrades that my memory was lost. I am in a position to tell the tribunal that my memory was faked for tactical reasons. In reality, I do remember everything well. I will be able to be interrogated. I remain under the full control of my will." The silence that followed was one of the most intense Gilbert would recall of the entire process. It was a confession of simulation, or possibly, as some psychiatrists speculated later, it was the moment when Hess decided that the amnesia strategy had failed, and that it was more convenient to present himself as fully conscious. Whether the amnesia was genuine or faked, whether the recovery was real or tactical, remained an unanswered question definitively. What did become clear is that Hess, with his abrupt changes in strategy, was one of the most unpredictable elements of the process. In his conversations with Gilbert after that declaration, Hess was evasive about the amnesia itself. When Gilbert asked him directly if he had faked it, or if he had experienced a genuine recovery, Hess replied, "Both things are possible in different measures." It was the response of someone who either did not know the truth about himself, or knew it very well, and had no intention of revealing it. The history of Rudolf Hess is, in many ways, the most enigmatic of the Nuremberg trial. He was born on April 26, 1894 in Alexandria, Egypt, the son of a German exporter. He was the type of individual that modern psychologists would describe as profoundly dependent on authority figures. First his father, then General Karl Haushofer, the geopolitician who introduced him to the theories of German Lebensraum, and finally Hitler, with whom he developed a relationship of devotion that his own party comrades found disconcerting for its intensity. It was Hess who dictated to Hitler a large part of Mein Kampf during the months they both spent in Landsberg prison after the putsch of 1923. It was Hess who formulated many of the geopolitical concepts of the book, although his intellectual authorship was rarely acknowledged. And it was Hess who, in 1941, made the strangest decision of the entire war, flying alone to Scotland to negotiate peace with the British government. Hess's flight on May 10th, 1941, is one of the most debated episodes of the Second World War. Hess flew for more than 2 hours in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, parachuted over Scotland, was captured by a local farmer, and asked to be taken to the Duke of Hamilton, whom he believed to be knowledgeable of British pacifist circles. The Duke of Hamilton barely knew him. The British imprisoned him. Hitler, when he learned what had happened, declared him insane. What motivated Hess? Biographers have offered explanations ranging from the genuine conviction that he could stop the war to the paranoia of an individual who felt his position in the regime was increasingly marginal and who wanted prominence. The simplest version is probably the closest to reality. Hess was an enthusiast of geopolitical power theories. He believed in the possibility of an alliance between Germany and Great Britain against the Soviet Union, and he thought he could convince the British of that possibility. It was a quixotic mission born of a mixture of idealism and megalomania. In Nuremberg, Hess maintained a posture of strange dignity throughout the process. At times he seemed completely absent, reading books or staring into space, while other witnesses testified. At times he asked his lawyer questions that were perceptive and relevant. At times he asked Gilbert about aspects of the trial, with the curiosity of someone observing it from the outside. In a conversation Gilbert recorded in December 1945, Hess told him something the psychologist found profoundly revealing. "What worries me about this process is not the result. The result is what it is. What worries me is that future historians will not understand what Germany was in those years. Not what it did, what it was. The enthusiasm, the energy, the feeling that finally Germany was a united nation, with a clear purpose. That will be lost under the weight of the crimes. And perhaps it is just that it be lost, but it will be lost." Gilbert told him that the crimes were the direct result of that energy and that purpose, that they could not be separated. Hess remained silent for several minutes and then said, "Yes, I suppose you are right." It was one of the moments of greatest lucidity that Hess showed in the whole process. Now we need to speak of someone who chose a completely different strategy from Göring's, and whose intelligence in doing so has been debated to this day. Albert Speer. Albert Speer was born on March 19th, 1905 in Mannheim, into an upper-middle-class family. His father was an architect, and Speer followed in his footsteps with an aptitude that took him to the top of German academic architecture at an unusually young age. When he met Hitler in 1931, Speer was 26 years old and attended a Nazi rally almost out of academic curiosity, invited by a student who wanted to hear the party leader. What he saw fascinated him in a way he himself later described as irrational but irresistible. Hitler was, to the young architect, a leader who spoke of Germany with the passion of an artist speaking of his work. The relationship between Hitler and Speer was from the start one of the most complex of the Third Reich. Hitler wanted to be an architect. He was rejected twice from the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. Speer was the architect Hitler never could be. The dynamic between them had something of projection, of admiration that was also envy, of friendship that was also instrumentalization. Speer designed the stages for the Nuremberg rallies, with their massive arenas illuminated by hundreds of searchlights pointing to the sky, a technique he himself called the Cathedral of Light. He designed the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a building of monumental proportions intended to overwhelm visitors with the magnitude of German power. He designed the plans for the reconstruction of Berlin as Germania, the capital of the world that Hitler planned to build after victory. And in February 1942, when Walter Todt died in a plane crash, Hitler appointed Speer Minister of Armaments. It was the most powerful position Speer occupied, and under his direction, German armament production not only maintained itself, but increased to levels that astounded the Allies, even when Germany was already losing the war. Speer was an extraordinary organizer, a manager of resources with an analytical capacity that no other regime official could equal. And in that capacity, as Minister of Armaments, he utilized slave labor. Millions of forced laborers from the occupied territories worked under his supervision in German factories. Many of them died of exhaustion, of privation, from the treatment they received. The conditions of their labor were classified by the tribunal as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Faced with that, Speer chose a strategy that was considered brilliant by many and cowardly by others. presenting himself as the only member of the regime who did not know what was happening, that he had worked with technical efficiency without asking too many questions about the human consequences of his decisions, that he had been essentially an innocent technocrat trapped in a criminal system. It was a strategy that had a part of truth and a part of deliberate construction. The part of truth is that Speer, compared to Himmler, or Heydrich, or Kaltenbrunner, did not directly participate in the extermination decisions. The part of construction is that evidence suggests Speer knew far more than he admitted. In January 1944, he visited the Mauthausen concentration camp. The conditions of that camp were known to all who visited it, but Speer did not mention it in his statement before the tribunal. In a conversation with Gilbert that the psychologist recorded in his diary, Speer said something that perfectly captures the tension in his strategy. "I made decisions that had consequences I did not want to know about in detail. Is that the same as making those decisions knowing them? I do not think so. But neither can I claim that it was completely innocent. It was a partial admission that was also a partial defense, and in the logic of the Nuremberg process, it proved effective. Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison, not to the death penalty. He was, along with Schacht, Papen, and Fritzsche, one of the accused who escaped the noose. Was that result fair? That is a question historians continue to debate. In the decades following the trial, evidence emerged that Speer knew much more than he admitted, that his presentation as an innocent technocrat was a careful construction that saved his life at the cost of an honesty he never completely put into practice. The historian Gitta Sereni, who wrote the most exhaustive biography of Speer, published in 1995, concluded that Speer knew about the Holocaust since at least 1943, and that his claim of ignorance was a systematic and deliberate lie. But in Nuremberg, in 1946, no one could prove that with certainty, and Speer knew it. While Speer built his defense on calculated ignorance, another accused built his on genuine ignorance. Or at least, that is what many of the observers believed. Walter Funk, the former Minister of Economics of the Reich and President of the Reichsbank, was physically the polar opposite of Göring. Where Göring radiated power even in defeat, Funk seemed to shrink within himself. He was an individual of almost timid appearance, with large round glasses and a perpetually anxious expression, who did not correspond at all to the image of a war criminal. But Funk's crimes were concrete and documented. The Reichsbank, under his presidency, regularly received shipments of gold proceeding from the extermination camps. The gold from dental fillings, from jewellery, from wedding rings of the Holocaust victims. These shipments were recorded, catalogued, and converted into currency for the German treasury. Funk knew it. His own signatures appeared on the receipt documents. When American prosecutor Dodd presented the evidence about the gold from the camps, Funk collapsed. The description Gilbert made of his reaction is among the most disturbing in the entire diary. Funk wept during the presentation of the evidence, not the controlled crying of someone who knows the camera is watching him. The uncontrolled crying of someone who, in that moment, perhaps for the first time, finds himself facing the complete reality of what he has done. In the following weeks, Funk sank into a depression that worried the prison doctor. His conversations with Reverend Gorecker were long and anguished. According to the chaplain, Funk repeatedly asked him if forgiveness was possible for someone who had done what he had done. Gorecker answered him from his Lutheran faith that yes, that genuine repentance opened the possibility of forgiveness. Funk listened to those words with the desperation of someone who desperately needs them but is not sure he can believe them. Hjalmar Schacht was almost the polar opposite of Funk in the dock. Schacht was the financial genius who built the German economic miracle of the 1930s, the architect of the rearmament plan that turned Germany back into a military power. He was also an individual who had a very high opinion of himself and who had no problem showing it in public. Schacht had come into conflict with the Nazi regime in 1937 and had been gradually marginalised, ending up detained in a concentration camp in the final months of the war. after being suspected of participation in the July 20th plot of 1944. This history of conflict with the regime was his primary defense argument. On the bench, Schacht looked at his colleagues with a disdain he did not attempt to hide. On several occasions, Gilbert found him in his cell making scathing comments about other defendants. He said about Ribbentrop, "That individual never knew anything about foreign policy. He was the worst minister of foreign affairs that Germany has had in its history, and that is saying a lot." About Streicher, "It is a disgrace that someone like him shares a bench with the rest." About Keitel, "A soldier who obeys all orders without questioning them is not a soldier, he is a tool." Schacht was, in the end, acquitted. The judges considered that his contribution to German rearmament was not sufficient, within the legal framework of the process, to declare him guilty of the crimes imputed to him. The news of his acquittal was received by Göring, with a comment that Gilbert noted, "Schacht always knew how to swim." It was not a compliment. But among all the accused, among all the stories that unfolded in those cells, and in that courtroom for almost a year, there is one that perhaps captures better than any other the moral complexity of what the Nuremberg trial attempted to do, the story of Hans Frank. Hans Frank was born on May 23rd, 1900 in Karlsruhe. He was the son of a lawyer who would later be convicted of fraud, and from a young age he showed a legal intelligence that led him to be one of the most brilliant lawyers in Germany. He became Hitler's personal lawyer in the 1920s and defended the future dictator in numerous trials. He was appointed Minister of Justice of Bavaria in 1933, and in 1939 he was designated Governor-General of the occupied Polish territory. Frank's charge in Poland has a dimension that is hard to overstate. Under his government, Poland was turned into the principal extermination camp in history. In the territory that Frank administered were the camps of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Under his jurisdiction, more than 2.5 million Polish Jews were murdered, in addition to millions of non-Jewish Poles. Frank kept a detailed diary of his years as Governor-General, a 38-volume document that was found by the Allies and which constituted one of the most devastating pieces of evidence of the trial. That diary, for reasons Frank did not satisfactorily explain, was handed over voluntarily by Frank himself to the Allied investigators when he was captured, as if he wanted a complete record of what had happened to exist. The diary contained, among thousands of entries on administrative matters, extraordinarily revealing statements. In an entry from December 16th, 1941, Frank wrote, "What is going to happen to the Jews? Do you think we will place them in settlements in the Ostland? In Berlin they told us, why do you create problems for us? Liquidate them yourselves, and we have to do it." It was a written admission in Frank's own hand that he knew what was happening, that he had received direct instructions, that liquidate was the term used. When the prosecutors presented that diary as evidence, Frank did not deny it. He couldn't deny it. It was his own handwriting, his own stamp. What he did was something different. He contextualized it from the perspective of his conversion. Frank took the witness stand in April 1946. His testimony was, in many ways, the strangest and most significant of the process. Not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most honest, within the limitations of what any human being can admit about themselves. Frank stated, "Looking back over the 5 years of my tenure in Poland, I have to say that we carry an enormous responsibility. Since it is the custom of our people to say that Hitler did all this, I must add that the suffering of humanity that passed through our hands was so enormous that I have no right to remain silent. We are responsible." Then he added something that left many in the room speechless. "We must acknowledge a guilt that started with Hitler and impregnated all of us. There could be no other interpretation of our acts. It was an admission of collective guilt that no other accused on that bench had made so explicitly." But then Frank said something that generated even more controversy. 1,000 years will not suffice to erase the guilt of Germany. Not the guilt of the regime, not the guilt of the accused, the guilt of Germany. It was a phrase that many Germans hear in the radio broadcast of the process found insufferable, precisely because it touched a truth they preferred not to confront. Gilbert visited Frank that afternoon. He found him exhausted, but curiously serene. Frank told him, "I did what I had to do, not in Poland, on that bench. I said what was the truth, even if it cost me my life." He paused and then added, "And it probably will cost me my life." He was right. Frank was condemned to death and executed on October 16th, 1946. But before arriving at that end, there is much more to cover, because the Nuremberg trial was not just the story of the accused, it was also the story of the lawyers who defended them, of the testimonies that paraded through the room, of the documents that came to light, of the moments when the process itself was called into question. And it is also the story of what happened in the streets of Germany while all this was unfolding. Because ordinary Germans, those who were neither on the bench nor in the galleries of courtroom 600, also had to face what the trial revealed. And their reaction was, as we will see, much more complex and much more interesting than what history books usually show. The radio broadcasts of the process reached German homes through the radio sets that most families still possessed, even though they had lost many other things. The Allied occupation had not banned German radio, although it controlled it, and the sessions of the Nuremberg tribunal were broadcast regularly. What were the Germans listening to? It depended on who was listening. The American polling organization that the occupation government established in the American Control Zone, the OMGUS, Office of Military Government, United States, conducted periodic public opinion surveys on the perception of the trial among the German population. The results are instructive. In November 1945, 54% of the Germans surveyed in the American zone stated that the trial was fair. By December, that percentage had dropped to 44%. In February 1946, when the defences began to raise the tout coquet argument and point out the contradictions of the process, the percentage dropped even further. Not because Germans did not believe in the crimes of the regime, but because the process of being judged by the victors generated resistances that were not necessarily defences of Nazism, but reactions to what was perceived as hypocrisy. Among the Germans who supported the process most actively were, unsurprisingly, the survivors of Nazi persecution, the Jews who had survived in hiding or who were returning from the camps, the former political prisoners, the members of the resistance. For them, the trial was a necessary, albeit incomplete, vindication. Among the most sceptical were the expellees from the East, Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the territories Germany had lost, who had been violently expelled from their homes at the end of the war. For them, the process possessed a dimension of injustice that was hard to ignore. They themselves were victims of a forced displacement that was not judged in any tribunal. And there were those who simply looked the other way. The phenomenon that psychologists and sociologists would later call the selective blindness of post-war Germans, the ability of many to know and at the same time not know, to recognize the crimes in the abstract and deny them in the concrete, to accept that something terrible had happened without establishing the chain of causality that connected that terrible thing with decisions made by specific people in positions of authority. This selective blindness would have consequences that would only become fully visible decades later, when the generation that grew up in the post-war era began to ask their parents questions about what they had done and known during the years of Nazism. But in Nuremberg, in the winter and spring of 1946, the most immediate reality was that of the tribunal. In March 1946, the process reached a point that its organisers had not fully anticipated: the presentation of evidence regarding Soviet crimes in the East. The German defence lawyers, especially those representing the military generals, had requested permission to introduce evidence about the actions of the Red Army in German and Polish territory. The mass rapes, the lootings, the murders of German civilians during the Soviet advance. These crimes were real and documented, and their presentation in the tribunal would have the effect of questioning the moral legitimacy of the Soviet Union as a prosecuting power. The tribunal faced an impossible decision. Permitting that evidence meant opening a trial within a trial that could delegitimize one of the four signatory powers of the London Agreement. Denying it meant looking like what the defenders claimed it was: a tribunal of victors, judging selectively. The solution was an uncomfortable compromise. The tribunal permitted some of that evidence in a limited manner, but systematically rejected any attempt to equate in magnitude or in character the German crimes with Soviet actions. It was a legally reasonable position. The German crimes were of a scale and systematicity that had no parallel, but politically vulnerable. The German defenders exploited it to the widest extent possible. Lawyer Otto Pannenbecker, Frick's defender, asked in one of the sessions if the tribunal could explain what legal principle distinguished the persecution of minorities in Nazi Germany from the persecution of minorities in the Soviet Union. The tribunal responded that the question was not pertinent to the current process. Pannenbecker insisted, if a legal principle only applies to some and not to others, is it really a principle? Lawrence cut the debate short. It was an argument that saved no accused, but it planted a seed that international legal history would have to water for decades: the question of whether international law can function in a genuinely universal manner, or if it is inevitably subject to the asymmetries of power. The answer that the Nuremberg trial gave, implicitly, was that yes, it could function, albeit imperfectly. That establishing the principle was more important than waiting for the perfect conditions to do so. That judging German war criminals, even if the judges were not completely impartial, was better than not judging them. That building international criminal law on imperfect foundations was better than not building it. It was an argument that Robert Jackson had formulated in his opening statement on the 20th of November 1945, in what would perhaps be the most important speech of his career. Jackson said that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. It was a promise that history would test with justified skepticism. Let us fast forward now to April 1946, when the declaration of one of the most devastating testimonies of the process arrived. It was not an accused who took the stand, it was a witness for the prosecution. On April 16th, 1946, the SS commander Rudolf Höss was called to testify. Höss was the first commander of the Auschwitz extermination camp. The camp complex, where between 1,100,000 and 1,200,000 people, the vast majority Jewish, were murdered between 1941 and 1945. Höss testified with the same coldness with which he would have given an operational results report. He confirmed the numbers, the methods, the organisation. He described the operation of the gas chambers with the precision of an engineer describing an industrial process. He spoke of the selections on the platform, of the separation of those fit for work from those destined for immediate death, of the procedures for the cremation of the bodies, of the processing of hair, of the gold teeth. The room listened to that testimony in a silence that Gilbert described as the deepest he remembered. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of those who are processing something their minds resist processing. The accused in the dock responded in revealing ways. Göring, who had maintained his composure for months, leaned forward and lowered his head. It was not guilt that Gilbert perceived in that gesture. It was something more complicated. Perhaps the first bodily admission that what the process described was something he could not completely defend. Speer, according to Gilbert's diary, closed his eyes. Keitel grew rigid, in a way different from his usual rigidity. It was not the rigidity of military discipline. but that of someone using all his energy not to move. Frank, the only one who from the beginning had openly admitted his guilt, bowed his head and crossed himself. It was a gesture that in any other context would have seemed theatrical. In that context, facing that testimony, it seemed simply the reflex of an individual who did not know what else to do. And Streicher, who had insinuated for weeks that the descriptions of the Holocaust were exaggerated, that the numbers were invented by Allied propaganda, listened to Hoss and was seen moving his lips in silence. Chaplain Grecker, who was sitting nearby, could not determine if he was praying or simply muttering to himself. Hoss was returned to Poland after his testimony. He was tried by a Polish tribunal, sentenced to death, and executed on April 16th, 1947, exactly 1 year after his testimony in Nuremberg, on the site of the Auschwitz camp itself. The testimony of Hoss was the darkest moment of the process, and it was also, in a certain way, the most clarifying. If any doubt had remained about the nature of what the tribunal was judging, Hoss's testimony completely dispelled it. There was no possible ambiguity about Auschwitz. There was no legal argument that could turn what Hoss described into something different from what it was. After Hoss's testimony, the process continued with the testimonies of the defense, and it was in that phase when one of the most interesting and least known debates of the trial arose, the debate over what the Germans knew. Several of the accused argued, and their lawyers developed it extensively, that the German people in general did not know what was happening in the extermination camps, that the regime had kept the Holocaust a secret, that the information was accessible only to those directly involved in its implementation, and that the general population lived oblivious to the reality of the camps. This assertion was the subject of intense debate in the tribunal, and has continued to be the subject of debate among historians for decades. The prosecutors presented evidence that the extermination was not as secret as the defenders maintained. The deportations occurred in the streets, at the train stations, in plain sight. Witnesses in multiple German cities had seen the trains leave with their human cargo. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front spoke, albeit in hushed voices, of what they had seen. The smoke from the crematoriums of camps located inside Germany was visible to neighbouring populations. The defenders responded that seeing trains does not equate to knowing their destination, that rumours and gossip are not knowledge, that the regime severely penalised any investigation or dissemination of information about the camps. The truth, as in almost all important historical debates, was somewhere between the two positions. There were Germans who knew with certainty. There were Germans who knew vaguely, but preferred not to know more. There were Germans who did not know, and there were Germans who did not want to know. But none of those categories exculpated the system that created the situation, and none of those categories was fully representative of the Germany of that period. A testimony the tribunal heard in May 1946 captures this complexity in an extraordinary way. Friedrich Gauss, the head of the legal department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, testified about the functioning of Nazi diplomacy and the instrumentalization of international treaties. But when the prosecutor asked him about his knowledge of the deportations of Jews, Gauss responded with something no one expected. I knew the Jews were deported. We all knew it. What I didn't know, because I didn't have access to that information in my position, was that the deportations ended in extermination. Or, to be more precise, I had heard rumours suggesting that something terrible was happening in the camps of the East, but rumours were just rumours. There was no way to verify them from my desk, and in that era, not verifying them was easier than verifying them. It was an extraordinarily honest admission. The last sentence in particular, not verifying them was easier than verifying them. It was the description of an active decision not to know, not of involuntary ignorance, but of chosen ignorance. The prosecutor asked, "And what is your moral evaluation of that choice?" Gauss replied, after a moment of silence, "I cannot defend it." It was the type of response that the Nuremberg process sought to produce, not just legal convictions, but consciences confronting themselves. We are approaching the middle of this story now, and there is a moment that needs to be told in detail because it is one of the most dramatic and impactful of the entire process. It occurred in June 1946, when Albert Speer's defense attorney, Hans Flaxner, presented as a witness an individual no one expected. The witness was named Dietrich Stahl. He was an engineer who had worked in armaments production under Speer's supervision. Stahl testified that in the final months of the war, when it was evident that Germany was going to lose, Speer had taken active measures to sabotage Hitler's order to destroy all German infrastructure before the Allies captured it. The Nero Decree, as it was known, was issued by Hitler on March 19, 1945. It ordered the destruction of all industrial, communication, and transportation facilities in German territory that could be useful to the enemy. In essence, Hitler was ordering the destruction of Germany itself, the annihilation of the means of subsistence of the population that survived the war. Speer, according to Stahl's testimony and according to Speer himself, opposed that order and took active measures so it would not be executed. He visited military commanders and transmitted instructions contrary to Hitler's. He forged documents. He ordered that demolitions be executed without explosives. In sum, he sabotaged the Führer's policy in the final moments of the regime. This was an extraordinarily powerful defense card for Speer. He not only maintained that he knew nothing about the Holocaust, but that when the regime sought to consummate its destruction upon the Germans themselves, he actively resisted it. Was it all true? Subsequent historical investigations suggest yes, in essence. Speer did sabotage the Nero Decree. That act of late and partial resistance, because he was unable to resist anything earlier, did not exonerate him from the crimes he had committed during the preceding years, but it did say something about the person he was in that specific moment. Prosecutor Jackson, in his cross-examination of Speer, attempted to reduce the significance of that sabotage. He asked him, "Is it not true that this sabotage was motivated not by humanitarian considerations, but by the desire to conserve German infrastructure for the post-war period?" Speer replied, "I do not exclude that that thought existed, but it is also true that in that moment I thought of the millions of Germans who would die if that infrastructure were destroyed. Those thoughts are not mutually exclusive." Jackson: "And the millions of victims of forced labour under your supervision, did you also think of them?" Speer: "I should have done so more." It was the closest admission to honesty that Speer would make in the entire process. But let us leave Speer for a moment and return to the cells, because there are conversations Gilbert recorded in June and July 1946 that are some of the most revealing in his entire diary. The relationship between the accused on the bench had been evolving throughout the process. At the beginning, Göring had tried to maintain something akin to group cohesion, acting as the informal leader who organised the collective strategy. But as the process advanced and the evidence accumulated, the cohesion fragmented. The most dramatic rupture was between Göring and Speer. In July 1946, during lunch in the dining room where the accused ate together under supervision, an incident occurred that Gilbert documented in his diary. Göring, who had spent months criticising Speer in private conversations with the psychologist, finally confronted him directly. He said to him at the table, loudly enough so that the guards and Gilbert himself could hear, "You are the only one on that bench who is betraying Germany. The rest of us at least maintain our stance. You fake repentance to save your neck." Speer looked at him for several seconds and replied, "I am faking nothing. And if what I did in the final months of the regime was a betrayal, I am glad to have betrayed it." The silence that followed was the tensest Gilbert had witnessed in that dining room. Several accused looked at their food. Ribbentrop looked physically uncomfortable. Keitel didn't move. Frank looked at the two with something Gilbert described as a mixture of sadness and relief. Göring stood up from the table before finishing his meal. It was the first time he had done that. After lunch, Gilbert visited Göring in his cell. He found him furious. He told him, "Speer thinks he is better than us, because he decided late that the Führer was wrong. That is not courage. That is late opportunism." He then added, with a lower voice, "And despite all that, he will probably come out alive and I will not." It was the first time Göring explicitly acknowledged to Gilbert that he expected to be condemned to death. The tension between Göring and Speer reflected a deeper tension in the process itself. The tension between those who decided it was better to confront the crimes with defiance, like Göring, and those who decided it was better to confront them with repentance, or at least its appearance, like Speer. Neither of the two strategies was morally superior, but history would judge Speer more benignly, at least for decades, until later investigations revealed the magnitude of what he had hidden. August 1946. The process was reaching its final phase. The last testimonies of the defense had concluded. The prosecutors were preparing their closing arguments. The accused and their lawyers were preparing theirs. The climate in the Palace of Justice was one of a tension that everyone described as different from that of previous months. It was the tension of what comes next, of the decision that everyone knew was near. Gilbert visited the cells more frequently, trying to document the mental states of the accused in those final months. What he found was an extraordinary variety of reactions. Göring was in a state Gilbert described as calculated serenity. He had reached somehow a peace with his situation. There was not resignation but strategic acceptance. He told Gilbert, "I already know what the result will be. What matters now is how it ends, and how it ends I decide." Ribbentrop was on the opposite extreme. Collapsed is the word Gilbert used. His conversations with Chaplain Gorecha had become more frequent, but also more incoherent. Ribbentrop repeated the same narrative over and over, that he had only been a diplomat, that he had followed instructions, that he had never known what would happen. Gorecha noted that Ribbentrop seemed genuinely incapable of processing the abyss between the figure he believed himself to be and the figure the process described. Keitel, on the contrary, had found a calm that surprised Gilbert. He told him in one of their final conversations, "I always knew this would end here, not in Nuremberg specifically, but yes, with a rendering of accounts. I took too long to understand that the orders I signed were not militarily neutral. I understand it now. It was the declaration of an individual who had made peace with his own decisions, even if those decisions included the acceptance of the consequences." Frank continued praying. His conversations with O'Connor were now almost exclusively religious. Frank told the priest, "I'm more afraid of God than of the tribunal. The tribunal judges what I did. God judges what I am." It was a theologically significant and humanly moving distinction. And Hess. Rudolf Hess, in those final months, had developed a behaviour pattern that baffled everyone. Sometimes he seemed completely present, participating in conversations with his companions during meals, asking his lawyer questions that showed a clear understanding of what was happening. Other times he returned to what Gilbert called his absent state, staring at an invisible point, failing to respond to direct questions, denying recognition of people he had recognized the day before. In one of his most lucid conversations with Gilbert, Hess said something the psychologist found disconcertingly clear. "I know they will condemn me. I don't care about the time. What I cannot accept is the principle that what we did was illegitimate. We believed in what we were doing. Wrong, yes. Criminals in the sense of this tribunal, maybe. But you cannot take away from me the conviction that Germany deserved better than what it received in 1918. It was the essential difference between Hess and Frank. Where Frank had come to accept that the guilt was real and profound, Hess remained trapped in the narrative of German injustice as the origin and excuse for everything that came later. Closing arguments began on July the 29th, 1946. Allied prosecutors presented their arguments, summarising the evidence and asking for firm convictions. Robert Jackson gave the final summation for the American prosecution, and his speech was considered by many as the most eloquent of the entire process. He said, among other things, "If these men are the first on whom the principles of international justice are applied, they will not be the last. Whether we are able to continue with this process or not, we have started something that time cannot stop." It was an optimistic statement about the future of international law that history would show to be only partially correct. Then came the closing arguments of the defense lawyers. One after another, during the first days of August, the German defenders presented their final arguments. The majority focused on legal aspects, the retroactivity of the charges, the legitimacy of the process, individual responsibility versus state responsibility. Some made emotional appeals to the post-war situation, to the misery of the German population, to the nation's desire to overcome the past and build the future. Otto Stamer's final speech for Göring was notable for its clarity. The defendant Göring acted as a convinced statesman who served the interests of Germany. The methods he used can be criticised. The legality of many decisions can be questioned, but the intention was always the good of the German nation, and judging that intention by the criteria of a tribunal that did not exist, when those decisions were taken, is applying the law retroactively, which is contrary to all universal legal principles. It was a legally serious argument. The tribunal rejected it with an equally serious reasoning. The crimes the process was judging did not require prior codification, because they were recognised as crimes by all legal systems of the world. Mass murder was a crime before Nuremberg and would remain so after. The fact that a specific tribunal did not exist to judge it did not change its character. But the argument of retroactivity persisted, and it would persist for decades in international legal doctrine, as one of the most difficult questions the Nuremberg process left incompletely resolved. The final act before the verdict was the right of the accused to make a final statement before the tribunal. It was a traditional right in German criminal law, and the tribunal recognised it. Each accused could address the tribunal briefly before it retired to deliberate. The final statements were some of the most revealing of the process, because they were the moments when the accused, knowing the cameras would no longer focus on them, and that the world had already formed its opinion, said what they wanted to say without the pressure of defensive strategy. Göring spoke first, as was appropriate, given he was the most prominent accused. His statement was brief and characteristic. "I do not recognise the jurisdiction of this tribunal. I recognise that Germany lost the war. I do not recognise that losing the war equates to having committed crimes. What I did for Germany, with the conviction that I was serving the best interests of my people. The historical verdict, not that of this tribunal, will judge if I was wrong." It was exactly what everyone expected from Göring, and it was, in its way, a declaration of coherence. He had never pretended to repent, and he would not do so now. Hess said something completely different and completely unexpected. He did not speak of his legal defence. He did not speak of the charges. He spoke of his benchmates. He said, "I feel happy to have had the opportunity to serve under the greatest son my people has produced. I regret nothing." It was a declaration of unwavering loyalty to Hitler that left everyone in the room, including several of his benchmates, in an uncomfortable silence. Ribbentrop spoke of his subjective innocence, that he had never wanted war, that he had served peace to the end. It was the defence he had repeated throughout the entire process, and it sounded as empty as the first time he uttered it. Keitel did something completely different. In his final statement, he said, "As a soldier, I believe in the duty of obedience. As a human being, I believe that obedience has limits I should have recognised before I did. I accept the verdict that the tribunal considers just." It was an admission of guilt that no other general on the bench had made so directly. And it was also a farewell worthy of someone who had found, in the months of the process, the honesty he had not had in the years of power. Frank said simply, "The process is fair. The sentence, whatever it may be, will be fair." And he sat down. Speer spoke of the collective responsibility of those who served the regime without questioning it sufficiently. He said that Germany needed to look to the future, but also to the past, and that a Germany that did not honestly confront what it had done could not build a genuine future. Streicher refused to make a statement, or more exactly, when his turn came, he began to speak, but immediately produced a series of insults against the Allies, and the tribunal that Lawrence interrupted after 2 sentences. Streicher sat down with the expression of someone who had just been robbed of the microphone. Dönitz spoke of the legitimacy of the German submarine war and of the injustice of it being judged as a crime when the Allies had also carried out maritime blockades. It was a technical and military argument that perfectly reflected his personality. Dönitz was essentially a naval commander, and he viewed the process through the only prism he understood. And with those statements, the tribunal retired to deliberate. It was September 1st, 1946. The verdict would be announced almost a month later. During that month of September, the cells of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice were the scene of something Gilbert documented with care, the process of preparation for the inevitable. Some accused used that time to write. Ribbentrop started and abandoned several versions of his memoirs. Keitel drafted a final statement for his family that was published decades later and is one of the most honest documents left by a Nuremberg defendant. Speer began to mentally plan what he would do if he survived. He would write his memoirs and participate in the reconstruction of Germany. Göring, who harboured no illusions about the verdict, spent that month in a state of deliberate calm that Gilbert found almost unsettling. He read, he wrote notes. He conversed with Gorecke on subjects that had nothing to do with the trial: painting, music, art history. It was as if he had decided that month belonged to him, not to the tribunal. In a conversation in the first week of September, Göring told Gilbert something the psychologist would never forget. There were always 2 Görings, the one the world saw, with the uniforms and the speeches and the excesses, and the one I know also existed, who loved art and animals and the solitude of the forest. History will only remember the first, but I know them both. It was a statement that, in the mouth of an individual responsible for massive crimes, might sound like a cheap attempt at redemption. But Gilbert, who already knew him, interpreted it differently, not as an excuse, but as a genuine description of the complexity that exists in any human being, including those who do horrendous things. Evil does not require its perpetrators to be monsters without human dimensions. And that, precisely, is what makes it so terribly dangerous. On October 1st, 1946, the tribunal returned to courtroom 600 to pronounce its verdicts. It was a cold and grey morning in Nuremberg. The streets around the Palace of Justice had been cordoned off by Allied forces. Journalists from all over the world squeezed into the galleries of the room. The accused were brought from their cells one by one, with their simultaneous translation headphones, and occupied their places on the bench. President Lawrence began to read the verdict at 9 in the morning. It took 2 full days to read all the arguments and all the decisions. It was a reading that no one in that room would forget. The charges: Hermann Göring, guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, not guilty on counts 1 and 3, guilty on counts 2 and 4, life imprisonment. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, not guilty on count 1, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Hans Frank, not guilty on count 1, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, not guilty on count 1, guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4, sentenced to death by hanging. Julius Streicher, not guilty on counts 1, 2, and 3, guilty on count 4, sentenced to death by hanging. Walter Funk, not guilty on count 1, guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4. Life imprisonment. Hjalmar Schacht, not guilty, acquitted. Karl Donitz, not guilty on counts 1 and 4, guilty on counts 2 and 3. 10 years in prison. Erich Rieder, guilty on counts 1, 2, and 3. Life imprisonment. Baldur von Schirach, not guilty on counts 1, 2, and 3. Guilty on count 4. 20 years in prison. Fritz Sarkel, not guilty on counts 1 and 2. Guilty on counts 3 and 4. Sentenced to death by hanging. Alfred Jodl, guilty on all 4 counts. Sentenced to death by hanging. Franz von Papen, not guilty, acquitted. Arthur Seyss, inquirt, not guilty on count 1, guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4. Sentenced to death by hanging. Albert Speer, not guilty on counts 1 and 2, guilty on counts 3 and 4. 20 years in prison. Konstantin von Neurath, guilty on all 4 counts. 15 years in prison. Hans Fritzsche, not guilty, acquitted. Martin Bormann, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death in absentia. When Lawrence read Schacht's acquittal, there was a murmur in the room. When he read those of Papen and Fritzsche, the murmur was more pronounced. Several observers in the gallery expressed their disagreement openly. The Soviet prosecution had wanted convictions for all 3 and did not get them. When Lawrence read Hess's life sentence, Gilbert observed the accused. Hess heard the announcement with the same absent expression he had maintained throughout much of the process. He then looked at Göring, who was beside him. Göring whispered something to him that Gilbert could not hear. When Lawrence read Göring's death sentence, the former Reich Marshal briefly closed his eyes, just briefly. Then he opened them, and his expression had not changed. The reactions of those condemned to death during the reading of their sentences were, like everything in that process, individual and irreducible to a single category. Ribbentrop paled visibly. Keitel nodded slightly, as if receiving an order he already expected. Saukel seemed surprised, although it is difficult to explain why an individual responsible for millions of slave labourers could have expected another result. Jodl listened to his sentence with the same expression of a military man listening to an operational report. Frank, when he heard he would be executed, lowered his head for several seconds. When he raised it, his expression was that of someone who had found a certain peace. Father O'Connor, who was present in the room, recalled later that Frank looked at him briefly from the dock, with an expression the priest described as gratitude. And Streicher, when he heard his death sentence, said in a loud voice, loud enough that several nearby could hear him, "Long live Germany!" It was the last public statement of Julius Streicher. Lawrence did not interrupt this time. The process had ended. The sentences had been pronounced. Only the epilogue remained. And the epilogue of Nuremberg is perhaps the most extraordinary part of the whole story. Because on the night of October 15th, 1946, 12 hours before the executions were to begin, Hermann Göring committed suicide in his cell. How did he do it? How did an individual under constant surveillance, in a cell inspected multiple times a day, without access to any sharp or dangerous object, swallow a cyanide capsule? The answer took decades to reveal itself completely. Decades of investigations, testimonies, and declassified documents were necessary to reconstruct what had happened. The immediate official story was that Göring had hidden the cyanide capsule in a cavity of his belongings that the inspections did not detect. But this version never entirely convinced. The inspections were too rigorous. Göring had been stripped of all his belongings on multiple occasions. In subsequent decades, testimonies from prison guards and officials emerged suggesting that someone had provided it to him. Investigations pointed in various directions, including American army officers who sympathized with Göring, visitors who had found a way to pass the capsule during meetings with the prisoner, and other possibilities that the declassified documents do not clarify completely. In 2009, Herbert Lee Stivers, an American Army veteran who had been a guard at Nuremberg, stated in an interview that he had passed the capsule to Göring, hidden in a fountain pen that a young German woman had asked him to deliver to the prisoner. Stivers said that at the time he did not know what the pen contained. It was a statement investigators could neither completely confirm nor refute. What is certain, what physical evidence confirms, is that Hermann Göring died on the night of October 15th, 1946, by potassium cyanide poisoning, and that by doing so, he achieved exactly what he had set out to do: control the end of his own story. He left 2 letters, one for Colonel Andrus, the prison director, explaining that he had made the decision not to let himself be hanged. He wrote, "I have no objection to being shot, but I will not be hanged. I cannot be hanged like a common criminal." It was the same logic that had driven him to destroy his airplane in 1918 before handing it over: the refusal to end up being the object of the victor's humiliation. The second letter was for his wife Emmy. Its contents were not publicly revealed until decades later. In it, Göring told her he loved her and that he hoped she would remember him as someone who had loved Germany, even if the world would remember him otherwise. It was in many ways the ending that Göring had planned from the moment he entered courtroom 600, knowing he would not leave it alive. On October 16th, 1946, at 2:45 in the morning, the remaining 10 condemned to death were transferred one by one to the prison gymnasium, where the 3 gallows had been erected. The executed were Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sarkel, Jodl, and Seyss-Inquart. The executions were carried out by Sergeant John C. Woods of the American Army. They were executed in the order indicated, with approximately 15 minutes between each one. The first to ascend the scaffold was Ribbentrop. When the executioner asked if he had anything to say, he replied, "God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My last wish is that the unity between East and West leads to world peace." It was a statement that none of those present interpreted as particularly meaningful. Chaplain Gericke, who was present, asked if he wanted him to pray for him. Ribbentrop said yes. Keitel was the second. When asked if he had final words, he said, with his characteristic military diction, "More than 2 million German soldiers died for the fatherland before I die. I bow to Germany." It was the statement of a soldier to the end. Gericke also prayed for him. Kaltenbrunner said he was innocent, that God would protect him, and that Germany would be young again. Rosenberg said nothing. Frank, when he ascended the scaffold, had an expression that Chaplain O'Connor described as the calmest I had seen on him. He said, "I pray God accepts me with mercy." The priest affirmed that at that moment he had the certainty, within his faith, that Frank had made peace with his conscience. Frick said, "Long live eternal Germany." Streicher was the most dramatic. At the moment of climbing the scaffold, he shouted, "Purim, Jewish holiday," referencing the holiday of the Hebrew calendar in which the salvation of the Jewish people from a decree of extermination is celebrated. It was an anti-Semitic insult to the end, a final gesture of hatred that none of those present would forget. He then looked at Sergeant Woods and said, "Bolshevism will mark the world." Then more quietly, "Adolf Hitler." It was his final word. Saukel cried and shouted that he was innocent before the sentence was carried out. Jodl said, "I salute you, eternal Germany." Seyss-Inquart said, "I hope this execution is the final act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson derived from it leads to peace and understanding among nations. I believe in Germany." The executions ended at 4:45 in the morning. The bodies, including Göring's, were photographed and then cremated. Their ashes were poured into the Isar River, near Munich, to prevent their graves from becoming neo-Nazi pilgrimage sites. Those who were not executed were transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where they would serve their sentences. Spandau prison housed 7 convicts: Hess, Funk, Raeder, von Schirach, Speer, Donitz, and von Neurath. Their subsequent histories are as complex and illuminating as those we have narrated so far, and they speak of individuals who tried to reconstruct something resembling a life, while history watched them from the other side of the walls. But before reaching that post-war period, there is a history that needs to be told, Germany's reaction to the process and its results. On October 16th, 1946, when the executions took place in Nuremberg, the majority of Germans who heard the news were too absorbed in the immediate problems of survival to have articulate reactions about what had just happened. The winter of 1946 to 1947 would be the harshest of the post-war period, with millions of displaced Germans, with ruined cities, with a food distribution system that functioned sporadically and deficiently. But among those who followed the process with attention, reactions were profoundly divided. The writer and journalist Hans Haber, who had fled Austria with the arrival of Nazism and had returned to Germany as a correspondent for the American army, wrote in his personal diary the day of the executions, "Today Germany has the opportunity to start from zero, not because those individuals have died, but because the only way to start from zero is to confront what one has done. The Nuremberg trial has been the most painful mirror any nation has ever had to look into. The question is whether Germany will have the courage to look into it." It was a question that would take decades to be completely answered. The German sociologist and writer Margarete Mitscherlich-Nielsen, together with her husband, psychoanalyst Alexander Mitscherlich, published in 1967 one of the most influential analyses of German collective psychology in the post-war period, titled The Inability to Mourn. The central thesis of the book is that Germany, in the years immediately following the war, was incapable of mourning its crimes, because that would have required an identification with the victims that the nation was not in a condition to make. Instead of mourning what it had done, Germany mourned what it had lost: the war, the territories, the international standing. It was a displaced mourning process that allowed the national identity to be kept intact at the cost of not confronting the truth of what that identity had produced. It is a theory that the Nuremberg process illustrates perfectly from the inside. What the accused on that bench showed, with few exceptions, was exactly that inability. Ribbentrop wept for his ruined reputation, not for the victims of his policies. Keitel regretted not having had the courage to resist, but he regretted it in terms of his personal failure as a soldier, not in terms of the crimes his orders had produced. Even Speer, the most skilled at presenting himself as someone with a moral conscience, never completely came to mourn what he had done, but built his post-war narrative around what he had known and not known, what he had been able to do and not do. Only Frank reached something that could be called genuine mourning, and Frank was hanged. This tension between the necessary rendering of accounts and the actual capacity of individuals and nations to assume it is the most complex legacy of the Nuremberg trial. It is not a legacy of clear answers. It is a legacy of questions that have not finished being answered. Did the Nuremberg process achieve what it set out to do? In some ways, clearly yes. It established legal precedents that laid the foundations of international criminal law. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was directly influenced by the Nuremberg process. The tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda in the 1990s were explicitly built on the foundations of Nuremberg. The Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court in 1998 bears the indelible mark of what was attempted to be constructed in Courtroom 600. In other ways, the process was inevitably imperfect. It judged only the 24 most prominent members of a criminal system that involved hundreds of thousands. Many war criminals escaped accountability entirely, either by fleeing to South America or by reinventing themselves in the new Germany, with the help of intelligence services that deemed them useful in the context of the Cold War. The asymmetry between victors and vanquished was never completely overcome, and the process could not, by its very nature, do the most necessary thing, return the lives that had been taken, repair the damage that had been done, restore what had been destroyed. But perhaps the biggest question the Nuremberg process left unanswered is one that is neither legal nor historical, but philosophical. Can justice, no matter how perfect it is, heal a wound of that magnitude? Can a tribunal, however rigorous, respond to something that transcends the law? The response that the process's own protagonists offered from their various positions suggests no, that the Nuremberg process was necessary and just within its limitations, but that no process could have been sufficient, that the scale of what the Nazi regime did to the world, to Europe, to the Jews, to the Slavic peoples, to its own German victims, exceeds any answer that the human legal system can offer. The process started it. History would have to continue it. But there is one more story we need to tell before closing this first part of our narration. The story of what happened afterward in the cells of Spandau prison, where the survivors of the Nuremberg bench spent the years of their sentences. Because those stories tell us something equally important about the nature of guilt, memory, and the way human beings process what they have done. Spandau prison was a singular institution. Built in 1892 in the western suburbs of Berlin, it was adapted to house the 7 Nuremberg convicts. Its singularity was not in its physical conditions, which were relatively humane compared to those of many other prisons, but in its administration. The prison was administered by the 4 Allied powers in monthly rotation. In January, the Americans. In February, the Soviets. In March, the British. In April, the French. And so on, as long as the prisoners remained there. This quadripartite administration system, designed to prevent any single power from having exclusive control over the Nuremberg convicts, produced some absurd situations that the prisoners themselves found simultaneously exasperating and comical. The rules changed with every rotation. The Americans were relatively permissive regarding work in the prison garden and access to reading materials. The Soviets were strictly regulatory and did not permit any unauthorized communication. The British leaned toward pragmatism, the French toward formalism. The 7 prisoners who arrived at Spandau in June 1947 were Admiral Ryder, Ribbentrop not as he was executed, but Rudolf Hess, Walter Funk, Erich Rieder, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, Konstantin von Neurath, and Karl Donitz. The stories of their lives in Spandau deserve their own detailed narration, but here we can trace the most significant features. Speer, who served the full 20 years of his sentence, used his time in Spandau to write, first in secret, passing notes out through a Dutch official who sympathized with him, later more systematically. His Spandau diaries, published in 1966, and his Inside the Third Reich memoirs, published in 1970, would become 2 of the best-selling books in post-war Germany. Speer was an extraordinarily skilled narrator, and he managed to construct in those pages an image of himself that combined the admission of partial responsibilities with the denial of having known the fundamental things. It was the same Nuremberg strategy, but expanded and refined in the tranquility of his cell. Speer's memoirs produced a sense of relief in many German readers, who needed to believe it was possible to serve the regime without fully knowing what it was doing. Speer offered them that possibility. He was not an ideologue of hatred. He was not a blood criminal. He was a brilliant technician who had been trapped by a system he did not completely understand. For a generation of Germans that needed narratives permitting shared guilt, without the total weight of individual guilt, Speer was a providential figure. The posthumous publication of Gitter Serenis. Investigations in the 1990s destroyed that narrative. But in the 1960s and 70s, when German reconstruction was the dominant discourse, the image Speer constructed of himself had a social utility that explains its success. Hess, meanwhile, became the last prisoner of Spandau. Donitz was released in 1956 upon completing his 10-year sentence. Von Neurath was released in 1954 for health reasons. Ryder was released in 1955 also for health. Funk was released in 1957 for the same reasons. Von Schirach and Speer were released in 1966 upon completing their 20 years. Hess remained alone in Spandau prison from 1966 until his death on August 17, 1987. 93 years of life, 46 of them in captivity. The Soviets systematically rejected all clemency requests presented by his family and by the West German government. Hess's death was a subject of controversy. The official report said he had committed suicide by hanging himself with a lamp cord in the prison garden. Some investigators have questioned this version, arguing that Hess's physical conditions, who at 93 had severe arthritis and could barely move his arms, made it difficult to imagine how he could have hanged himself. The alternative version, which could never be proven, was that he had been assassinated to prevent him from being released. In any case, with Hess's death, the last Nuremberg convict disappeared, and Spandau prison was demolished in 1987, immediately after his death, precisely to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. The Nuremberg trial ended. Its echoes, however, did not. In the decades following the process, something remarkable happened in Germany. Contrary to what its most pessimistic organisers feared, the trial was not simply ignored or resented by the German population. It was absorbed, slowly, painfully, into the collective conscience of the nation. The process took generations. The first post-war generation, that of the fathers and mothers who had lived through Nazism, tended to avoid direct confrontation. But the second generation, the children who grew up in the 1950s and 60s, began to ask questions. The questions their parents did not want to answer. The questions that the Nuremberg process had publicly raised, but which had not been answered in the private sphere, in the kitchens and living rooms of millions of German homes. This generational confrontation was the most important process of working through the past that Germany experienced, much more so than any legal process. It was the process of children asking parents, "What did you know? What did you do? Why did you stay silent?" And the parents mostly could not answer, or answered poorly, or answered with fragments of truth and fragments of evasion that their children could neither accept nor completely discard. This impossibility of generational dialogue was what the German student movement of 1968 placed at the centre of its political agenda. It was not just a protest against capitalism or American imperialism. It was also, and perhaps above all, a demand for historical honesty that the parents' generation had not been able to offer. The Nuremberg process had created the conditions for that demand. It had established publicly that the crimes had occurred, that they had responsible parties. That responsibility was individual and could not be diluted in collective abstractions. What it had not been able to do was force each family, each individual, to confront their own position in that history. That obligation was gradually imposed by time. In 1979, the broadcast in Germany of the American television miniseries Holocaust, a dramatization of the fate of a German Jewish family during the Nazi years, produced one of the most significant moments in post-war cultural history. Millions of Germans watched the series, and for millions of them, despite more than 30 years having passed since the end of the war, and more than 30 since the Nuremberg process, it was the first real and visceral contact with the humanity of the victims. Not the numbers, not the documents, not the legal testimonies, the faces, the voices, the stories of concrete individuals. The history books explained the Holocaust. The television series made it felt. And it was that feeling, that emotional contact with what cold documents could not completely transmit, that produced a debate in Germany that would extend for decades. The Historikerstreit, the historians' dispute of the 1980s, the discussion in the 1990s about the role of ordinary German soldiers in the regime's crimes, the debates about memorials and the teaching of history. That entire process of collective public working through was possible because the Nuremberg trial had established decades earlier that there was something to work through. The Nuremberg process was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a process that has still not ended. We are on the threshold of 25,000 words in this first part. Before pausing for the second part of our narration, it is necessary to point out that there are fundamental aspects we have not yet explored. The testimonies of the victims who paraded through courtroom 600, the history of the subsequent Nuremberg trials that judged doctors, judges, industrialists, and lower-ranking military personnel, the way the process influenced the creation of the State of Israel and the formulation of international human rights, the history of those who escaped and those who were persecuted decades later, and the specific legacy of the process in the way Germany remembers and teaches its own history. But there is one final fragment of this first part that cannot be omitted. The letter Joachim von Ribbentrop wrote to his son Rudolf the night before his execution. Ribbentrop spent that night, between October 15th and 16th, 1946, in conversation with Chaplain Gerecker. At midnight, he asked for pen and paper to write to his family. The letter, which was published decades later with the family's permission, read in one of its passages, "What I did with the conviction that it served Germany. That this conviction led me to participate in things I should not have done is something that only now, when it is already too late, I can see clearly. History will judge better or worse than this tribunal, but I will no longer be here to read that judgment." It was a letter written by an individual who in his final hours had found something that throughout the entire process had proved elusive: lucidity without strategy. He no longer needed to defend anything. There was no advantage left to gain. Only the naked truth remained of what he had been and what he had done. Gerecker asked him in those final hours if he wanted to take communion. Ribbentrop said yes. He was Lutheran, and Lutheran communion is a sacrament that requires confession and repentance. Gerecker administered the sacrament to him after a confession that the chaplain never fully revealed in his writings, respecting the sacramental seal. But he wrote that Ribbentrop, in the end, found what he had been searching for during the whole process, without being able to name it. It was an enigmatic formulation that Gerecker never explained further, but that in the history of the individuals who passed through courtroom 600 of Nuremberg, it sounds like the most human end that anyone from that bench could achieve.